This lecture turns from ancient Egypt in North Africa and looks to the Aegean Sea and the civilizations that would develop there in a prehistoric and ancient period that we will discuss today, specifically with the Cycladic style and the Minoan. Now, the prehistoric Mediterranean and Aegean is going to overlap the time period that we were discussing between the pyramids to King Tut. This is the civilization that directly precedes the rise of ancient Greece as a lone superpower in the West under Alexander the Great. The heroes of this generation are recounted in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and it wasn't until 1870 that they were regarded as anything except for myth. The Aegean civilization that we'll discuss today disappeared by the Archaic period and the poet Homer's time, so these individuals were transformed into a golden age of heroes, not thought to be flesh and blood and historically living individuals. Not until Heinrich Schliemann discovered the 13th century BCE city and ruins of Troy in modern-day Turkey. The discovery reinforced the existing Greek historians who had claimed that the Trojan War had taken place at the end of the 12th century BCE. Eratosthenes, for instance, is going to be one who states that the war lasted a decade, as described by Homer in the Iliad, and lasted from 1194 until 1184 BCE, culminating with the Trojans bringing the horse into the city with the Greek troops inside, thus ending this decade-long conflict. Now, how do we know about the civilizations that actually existed during the time in which Homer's Iliad is set? And the answer is we do have a written language. We have the Aegean documents written in different types of writing, linear A and linear B. This is a precursor to ancient Greek. But unfortunately, we have only managed to translate one of the three primary types of linear A and B to this date. And so we do not have still a clear understanding of the actual civilization, only what was handed down in the oral tradition by way of myth. Now, the prehistoric Aegean is going to be named as such because not for its period of time in which it takes place, but instead the cultural development for the islands of the Cyclades, of course named as such because they form a circle around the island of Delos, are going to have not yet invented writing. So we are still in prehistory by way of cultural development. What we know about the Cyclades that will foretell the Greeks and their passion for traveling and trade is that they have abundant marble quarries, but very little land in order to produce an abundant amount of agriculture and or grow large numbers of cattle on. So they had to learn how to trade early on in the civilization span. Here we find the Cyclades are just going to be to the east of the Peloponnesus and the main Greek mainland cities, and just north of Crete, where the Minoan civilization will rise here shortly. Now, the art that we find in Cycladic culture is going to be one that is highly geometricized and generally depicting women who are found in the graves of this culture and their people. Here, the figurine of a woman from Syros in the Cyclades from 2600 to 2400 BCE is going to be a good example of the type of sculpture we find in this area. Because we find two women here, different sizes, are going to have their arms folded over their chest, their legs pressed together tightly, as though they are going to be laid to rest in a grave. Now, these are going to be highly prized today, but only since the early 20th century, with the advent of modernity and modern sculpture, because they look like they foretold the abstract sculpture that will become common in movements such as Futurism, Cubism, and others. So we find that artists flocked to museums that now had Cycladic art in the ancient Mediterranean areas to study them, to see how to flatten out and or abstract the human form. Styles like that found in the Cyclades would in fact inspire modern abstraction like Cubism and other movements, helping artists understand how to abstract the human form, looking to the past for these solutions. So in the work, of course, the makers, the creators of these statuettes did not intend to be abstracting from the human form in an avant-garde fashion to depart from reality. These are used very specifically in the culture for its believed rites of passage and to mark important milestones in one's life. They are also going to mostly be representing nude women, not men with their arms folded. So we find that they're carved in marble with an obsidian, that being a volcanic glass scraper, and then polished to be very smooth at the end using emery stones. These are found in both graves and settlements in the Cyclades, in the surrounding islands, and so we know that they were used for different purposes, not only funerary purposes, but to also mark different occasions. Here's another example from 2500 to 2300 BCE, this one in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and this one's just over a foot high. In it, we have a female figure that was placed with her back in the grave, lying down as though she was deceased and prepared for the next life. It is only a half-inch thick, and so it is very wide yet quite thin. And it is schematized or geometricized into the shapes of a triangle. So we have these overlapping triangular forms and features that direct and dictate the form of the figure. Of course, the inverted pubic triangle ensures that we understand this figure is female, as does the protruding breasts and, of course, the vulva. Now, these are not always found in women's graves, however. They are going to extend the same type of poses and the same type of figures in both men and women's cultural experiences at the time. Now, originally, these would have been painted blue, red, and green, which we know from infrared reflectography and microscopy. You can see remnants of red paint over the left breast of the main figure here, for instance. So we find that the figures, are they in fact representing fertility? That being, are they trying to encourage fecundity in this culture? Are they goddesses and or otherwise very important and or religious figures that we would pray to control our world spiritually or to pray to upon death? We know that they're trying to emphasize that they're feminine because we're focusing on the same aspects that early man has since the Paleolithic age with the Venus of Willendorf. We have swelling breasts, an emphasized pubic area, a belly that is also protruding and swelling, and it was painted. Here you see remnants of a red swath of paint moving from the top right to the lower left of the torso. If we overlay geometric shapes onto these figures, we can see how they're going to be bound by this repeated schematization and or geometricization. It's a way in which for early man to understand the world by imposing patterns on it, shapes on it. Turning now to the prehistoric Aegean, the civilization that we do have a written record for, but do not understand all of it yet, is the Minoan civilization. So Minoan comes from King Minos, who is going to be the king who is the offspring of Zeus and Europa. And this is the story where Zeus is going to transform himself into a beautiful white bull and present a flower from his snout, seducing the beautiful Europa and taking her out into the sea. He swims so far out that she can no longer see the edge of the Peloponnesus, and they wind up on Crete. He transforms back into his godly anthropomorphic form, makes love to her, and 9 months later, King Minos is born. Now, Crete is going to rise as the dominant superpower in the Mediterranean at this time. So we find that when we see the decline of Egypt, Crete is rising as a trading center that's going to be ruled by an oligarchy. Now, Sir Arthur Evans in 1910 discovers the palace that he believes is going to be that of King Minos, not knowing that they had a different form of government because he did not translate their writing as of yet. But as with every one of these archaeological discoveries we've discussed, the archaeologists of the late 19th and early 20th century primarily are focused on either proving the archaeological evidence true or false in the Bible, or discovering massive tombs or castles or palaces relating to historical kings, very important monarchs, not lower class or middle class settlements. That's not what their primary focus is. So they are blinded by the fact when they find something that it must be, as they would have suspected with confirmation bias, a palace for a king. Here, the palace at Knossos at Crete, he believes is going to be the palace for King Minos because it resembles a maze in the lower levels. Now, why would maze-like structures have suggested King Minos? And the answer is the story relating to Theseus and the Minotaur. Now, everyone knows the Minotaur, that being the head of a bull on the body of a man, a grotesque beast that was fed virgins to devour alive in human sacrifice periodically from the Greek mainland. Now, how we get to the Minotaur is an interesting story because King Minos makes an agreement with Poseidon to sacrifice his best bull every year. Only one year a bull was born that was so perfect, so beautiful, that he could not bear to part with it. So he sacrifices a lesser bull instead. We find that Poseidon, of course, then states, if you love your bull so much, I'm going to make your queen fall in love with the bull. So Pasiphae falls madly in love with this bull, that's King Minos' queen. She comes to Daedalus, the greatest craftsman and inventor of the ancient world, and asks him to construct her a hollow cow costume to climb into, so that the bull could then have congress with her and impregnate her. 9 months later, the Minotaur is born. The bull of Minos, literally, is what it translates. So here is a later painting from Pompeii of the bull costume or the cow costume that Pasiphae is climbing into in order to make love to the bull. This is the punishment of King Minos for trying to trick or betray a god. So we find that King Minos demanded 14 youths from Athens to feed the Minotaur on lunar cycles. We find that Theseus is going to be the prince of Athens, who is going to succeed in slaying the Minotaur with Ariadne's help, Ariadne being the daughter of Queen Pasiphae and King Minos. She betrays her parents and helps Theseus to slay the Minotaur by giving him a clue, which is a ball of yarn that he uses to find his way back out of the labyrinth, the house of the double axes for sacrificial slaughter. He then, of course, takes her back to Athens, but drops her off on the island of Naxos and leaves her to die en route. Because she betrayed her father, she would not make a good wife in the Greek tradition and belief system. Now, the belief that they had found this maze, this labyrinth in which the Minotaur would have been kept, designed by Daedalus to punish those that were going to challenge the king, is going to be an amazing discovery that Sir Arthur Evans hopes he has made. However, this is not a palace because Crete was not ruled over by a monarchy or a king, but instead by an oligarchy. And they did not live here, therefore it could not be a palace even for oligarchs. This was instead a economic repository or trading center. In this economic center, we do not have large areas for individuals to live or to sleep or to eat for that matter. There are some domestic quarters generally thought to be used for traveling salesmen or tradesmen that are going to be moving about selling their wares. What we primarily find is going to be these storerooms for goods that are going to then be exchanged in this economic center. Now there are tripartite shrines and or areas to pray to the gods for a safe passage and or to bless your commerce. But these are not very large open air structures for altars and or for public worship. These are private small areas. Now, the decorations that we find here at Knossos tell us a good deal about the civilization on Crete. They're going to be built up over a series of centuries, from 1700 to 1400 BCE. We have the Bronze Age building over the original Neolithic structures that originally existed, in some areas 4 stories high. Now the mud bricks are going to be faced with a local stone that has been dressed and or carved in order to fit more seamlessly in with other stones next to it. An earthquake in 1700 BCE, we know, destroyed a good deal of the structure, and the entire center is going to be repaired and enlarged thereafter. The complexity and maze-like confusion of the building is due to these reconstruction efforts in which there are passageways that do go nowhere because they did not dig out all of the refuse and rubble from the previous earthquake, merely building new passageways and ways around the palace or the economic center. Decorations in the palace reveal that, like the ancient Mediterranean and Mesopotamian civilizations before them, the Cretans or Minoans are going to worship bulls, and as part of a rite of passage that continues in the Mediterranean culture today, young men, to prove their virility and that they have achieved manhood, would perform acrobatic feats with bulls. Here, the bull leaping fresco that has been restored at the Palace of Knossos is one of the most famous. It is a mural that covers an entire wall, but it is going to be painted in buon fresco, or good fresh, or wet lime plaster. Many of the sections do not survive and so have been reconstructed here. Now, the idea of fighting a bull and or performing daring feats around it is nothing new, and we see it especially in Spanish culture and in Italian culture today, where we'll have matadors fighting bulls, and or actual bull leaping still exists, where individuals will leap over charging bulls, showing their masculinity and fearlessness. In the flying gallop here, we have this highly stylized understanding of the bull and the 2 women and men in this painting. For this funnel of energy is going to find the figures have pinched waists to suggest that they are moving relatively rapidly. So we are not trying to show them anatomically correct. We are not trying to suggest the proper linear perspectival or atmospheric perspective understanding of the scene, but instead to suggest liveliness, vivacity. The long hair of the figures also cascading down appropriately like this funnel that's going to be pushing the bull forward, that is held by the horns by this woman who's going to be all the way to the left. So the curvilinear lines and elasticity of form is indicative of the Minoan civilization, who will prize bright colors, liveliness, vivacity, motion, and movement. This is what they value, that they will pass on to the ancient Greeks, an appreciation for liveliness and action, instead of permanence that we find in the Egyptian civilization. Now, in the restored lighter areas, you can see that the male and female figures are going to be shown differently. For going back to the Sumerian civilization and then the Egyptian civilization we just discussed, women are going to be shown as having ochre-colored skin or lighter complexions than their male counterparts. Men are generally going to be shown as dark and ruddy to indicate that they are outside more, that they are exposed to the sun more, and that their professions are going to take them in the public sphere of life. This is going to be true in the painted decoration and polychrome statues in ancient Egypt as well. Here we find two women off to the side, just like the bull leaping ceremony here, with two men embracing in the middle. The Minoans are going to worship many different deities. They are not a monotheistic civilization, and they will pass this on to the ancient Greeks. Here, the snake goddess, one of a type that we find many of in the Cretan civilization, the ancient Minoan civilization. We have a woman or a goddess with snakes that is found in the palace of Knossos in one of these shrines for worship. So the belief with this figure that is over a foot tall, that it is probably a goddess, is going to be made clear by way of the snake she's holding and the leopard sitting on her head. Not to mention the exposed breasts that she has in her wonderfully colorful garment here. So this is reconstructed from a tripartite shrine which would have had 3 different deities in it. This is faience, a colorfully glazed pottery to suggest the colorful decorations and the types of clothing that women would have worn. Now the dress that she's wearing is going to be multi-sectioned, and when she would spin or move in space, they would flare out. So these brightly colored dresses would catch one's eye and are designed for maximum motion. The figure is going to be found in a shrine, much like those earlier Sumerian statuettes who look up. But now we find she controls aspects of nature. She's going to be holding snakes. She has a leopard on her head. And mortals do not generally control wild animals in such a way. So it is believed that this is going to be a water goddess that controls these aspects of life in the wilderness. So this is the most common type of statuette that we find in Minoan civilization, your female holding serpents. So again, the regenerative power of femininity and the protection of the home relates in the Greek and Roman civilizations to women as well. Nymphs are going to still be associated with freshwater springs, and we find that the goddess of the hearth and home will be Hestia or Vesta in the Roman tradition. Now, this is not monumental. We find no monumental statues, in fact, in the Minoan civilization. The exposed breasts and the wild animals show us that she has a mastery of the animal world, which would be appropriate for a deity, and will be passed on in goddesses like Artemis for the ancient Greeks. Now here we have the ancient Egyptian, Sumerian, and Minoan civilizations seen in a series of statues. So what the Minoans are going to adopt from the Egyptians is going to be the frontality of the presentation of figures and the large emphasis placed on eyes, these large staring eyes. What is unique to them, however, is the costume and motion. That being, the figures are going to be in open poses, lifting their limbs, snakes writhing in them. Brightly painted are the costumes that they wear. And so this becomes the hallmark for the Minoans: liveliness, vivacity, action. In each one of these, we have what will become the basis for Greek art, an interest in liveliness, in anatomical correctness, and once again, bringing everything they have learned to bear from other civilizations into something new and unique. So ancient Aegean art is modeled on ancient Egyptian art, but with a much greater interest in liveliness, anatomy, and motion. This leads to a radical stylistic evolution in ancient Greece, in which every generation a new style will emerge to refine and reflect on what their ideal is. And that ideal is going to be the perfect individual. Now, continuing with the Minoans, who are going to be on the island of Crete, dominating the Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium BCE, we have developed Chimeris ware, named for the town of Chimeris near the cave on Mount Ida that overlooks Phaistos. Here we have a type of pottery that would become so popular and be produced in many cities on the island of Crete that it would be exported to Egypt and Syria, highly prized for its thin nature, its delicate decorations and glaze. Now, in the 2nd millennium BCE, we have the potter's wheel invented, which is still a very important invention in the history of material culture. For, as we discussed in the Neolithic period, we do find earlier remnants of cups and bowls, but usually they're made in very small batches and they cannot be replicated. So generally they're used for holding objects for ceremonies and or ritualistic libations. With the invention of the kick wheel, we could form uniform standards for pottery and ensure that we have a consistent width and shape of a vessel that we can build up into greater and more complex shapes. So this allows us to then create objects not only for holding materials and shipping them, such as wine and olive oil, but to be appreciated aesthetically in and of themselves. Now, the harvester vase is going to come from Hagia Triada on Crete and is going to be created in around 1500 BCE. Now, we find that only the upper portion of the vase and the neck survives. The lower section is going to be a recreation. It is, in fact, a rhyton, which is going to be a ritualistic vessel used for drinking ritualistic libations. Usually alcoholic or hallucinatory substances are going to be taken by way of these vessels during religious practices, much as in the Eucharist today, Catholics drink wine. This is just going to have been much more strongly potent and used more broadly in the ancient Mediterranean than in today's modern Christian world. The dominant forms of these rhytons, as you can see here, very often take on the appearance of bulls and or other powerful objects associated with kingship. So in this one, for instance, you would fill up the vessel and drink from the bull's mouth, taking into yourself the power, the sustenance, and the masculinity and virility of this bull. On the harvester vase, we do not see bulls, but instead a group of 27 men who are marching and chanting, moving left to right. Here is an image of them laid out entirely, where we can see them in various positions, overlapping sometimes 4 men deep, all carrying these threshing rods, being led by one man in a cloak at the front. So here you have another detail showing them singing in riotous action and motion and are ready to go about the planting or harvesting. So the figure at the front is obviously leading them. He has long hair and a ceremonial cloak, along with a commanding staff. We are giving thanks to the spring planting or the fall harvest in a religious procession, often accompanied by a dance. That is the most likely scenario that we have here, giving thanks to the gods and goddesses for allowing us to grow from the land, to get sustenance from their gifts to us. The subject, that is, the subject of harvesting, was common in ancient Egyptian art, and we have seen it before, such as with the painting of the goats treading seed and the cattle fording a canal. However, unlike the ancient Egyptians, we do not have a repeated series of figures that are identical and do not overlap. Instead, we have an individualized, riotous crowd with an interest shown in facial expression, muscular skeletal structure, and the action and activities made possible by the nude human form. This is very different and will show us the new direction in art that we'll look at next. Now, following the Minoans, the next civilization to rise on the Greek mainland is the Mycenaean, otherwise known as the Helladic civilization from 3000 to 1000 BCE. Now, the name Helladic comes from the Greek name for Greece itself, and that is Hellas. Hence, Helladic is going to represent the Aegean Bronze Age on the mainland of the Peloponnesus and of Western Europe. Now, we know that the native peoples living here in a Neolithic culture were displaced by Greek-speaking peoples who arrived around 3000 BCE, making their way south. They brought with them metalworking, ceramics, architectural designs, all of the things necessary for civilization, and that made it fairly easy for them to brush aside a culture that was still using stone weapons and tools. Now, Mycenae, which is going to be on the Peloponnesus here in the south, is going to rise to power to influence all of the islands in this coming period. Now, Mycenaean civilization is going to be supposedly where Agamemnon's citadel is going to be held and located, and so we find that this is dedicated and is found historically during the Trojan War around 1200 BCE. Of course, Troy being right across the Aegean Sea and the main ancient rivals to the Bronze Age Greeks. Now, the palace and citadel of Tiryns at Mycenae, which is built around 1400 to 1200 BCE, expanded each time that the power of the Mycenaeans expands, shows us that this civilization is not ruled by an oligarchy or democracy, but instead by a monarchy. Now, different from the Minoans, this citadel is a walled fortress or palace that is going to sit high on a hilltop, making it even more difficult to conquer and or breach the city walls. Each time the civilization grew, these walls expanded further and further outward, being rebuilt 3 different times, each time larger and stronger than the last, from 340, 1250, and finally in 1200 BCE. Now, the last one, of course, was intended to protect the water supply, because that would be the easiest way to lay siege to a citadel if you could poison the wells. Now, the main entrance leading to the inner keeps is going to force you through this narrow passageways with crenulated towers to either side, making it easily defensible by archers. Now, the walls would have been imposing. This corbelled gallery in the walls of the citadel showing you what the defenders of the city would have seen as they moved between the walls to the windows to surveil the land surrounding them and or to fire projectiles at enemies below. Now, Pausanias, who's going to write a guidebook to Greece and places to visit in the 2nd century Common Era, is going to state that these walls were as spectacular as the pyramids themselves. And they are going to be massive. This very much impressed the ancients. They're 25 feet thick and 30 feet high, which is standard for defensive walls since the Neolithic period. This makes them ideal for defense. The large megalithic blocks are going to be cantilevered inwards and are not dressed, and they do not have mortar. Therefore, they look fairly primitive and unfinished, which led the ancient Greeks, given their size and unfinished nature, to the conclusion that men could not move these. They must have been built by Cyclops. Hence, these are called Cyclopean masonry examples. So only the one-eyed creatures from mythology, such as Polyphemus, who eats Odysseus's men, would be able to lift such huge, massive megalithic stones. Here is another view of the exterior showing you the sheer power and brute force that is suggested when approaching these walls, which must have intimidated Bronze Age Greek individuals who came to visit this citadel. Now, the architecture used to create it is not new, that being, it is a corbelled arch in which you have the stones inset and leaning on one another. Thus, of course, they press against one another to hold up these interior spaces. very much like an unfinished version of the Grand Gallery of Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza. Only this time we see the stones are unfinished here. Leading up to the entrance of the citadel, we have the Lion Gate, which is going to, at the same time, introduce you to the city and protect the city simultaneously as an apotropaic device. Now, the corbelled arch is going to be relieved by way of the weight above this massive stone lintel by way of a relieving triangle. And the relieving triangle has a carving of it of two feline or lion-like creatures flanking a column. Now, this relieves the weight and, of course, makes it possible to have a larger open area to the gate. Now, the Lion Gate, as it's called, does not show animals with teats or penises, so we do not know if they are a particular gender. We also do not have their heads, so if they were eagle heads, they could have been griffins, but they need wings. If they were human heads, then they could be influenced by the ancient Egyptians because they would relate to sphinxes. What we do know is that they are Near Eastern in origin and shows us that the civilization had contact with the area now known as Turkey and the ancient Sumerians and Mesopotamians before them, because we have a heraldic device here. We have a composite creature of animals or sphinxes, but also flanking a central image, which is close to the heraldic devices unique to Mesopotamia, where you would have a central figure flanked by the same two figures on either side. Now we know that Agamemnon and other rulers in Mycenae, had they existed, would have been buried in structures like what we see here. The so-called treasury at Atreus, discovered by Schliemann, he is going to believe this is actually where Agamemnon was buried. However, this was not the treasury where he would bring back the gold and jewels and the war booty from the War of Troy. Instead, this is a type of tomb known as a tholos tomb, in which all wealthy Mycenaeans were buried outside of the citadel. These are circular beehive-shaped tombs, hence they get their name from the circular shape. Now, leading up to this beehive-shaped tomb, we have a tholos, a circular tomb, yet the entryway is known as a dromos, as seen here. The dromos, much like earlier Karen tombs in the UK, would prepare the visitor for visiting the deceased, entering into the realm of the underworld. For the deceased corpses of their ancestors were not buried here, but instead laid out on the floor in a ceremonial fashion. Now, in Neolithic passage graves, we would have had also a long entryway with these entoptic images that allowed us to contemplate death as we approached before seeing and entering the tomb itself proper. Once entering the actual tomb, here we have the vault of the tholos seen upward and the relieving triangle above the door, which is very impressive for the ancient Greeks who follow these Bronze Age predecessors. At 43 feet high, we have a massive interior space that is the oldest surviving corbelled vaulted dome in antiquity and the largest enclosed interior space without supports until the Pantheon is created around 125 Common Era. However, the Pantheon's dome is made of solid concrete, and the Romans are working with much more sophisticated technologies than the Mycenaeans. Inside of these tholos tombs, as in the treasury of Atreus, as it's understood here, we would have had the wealthy laid out on the floor, men and women. And here we have the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, certainly a funerary mask that would have gone over the head or face of the deceased on the ground. Now, tombs are reserved for kings and their families, the most wealthy members of this monarchy. The dead are laid out on the floors of these tombs, not buried. their faces covered with masks to avoid seeing the decomposition and effects on the bodies. Men are going to be adorned with what they were associated with in life, weapons, while women are also going to be buried with what they are most known for, jewelry. So in this civilization, men are expected to be warriors, while women are held up as models of beauty, chastity, and virtue. To make the funerary mask, we have a new technique here known as repoussé, in which we have the metal flattened area here that's hammered from the back and pushed forward to create this relief of a face. Now, the types here are not unique to one individual, such as the king Agamemnon, but instead relate to types such as the youthful or mature type. In the case of the death mask of Tutankhamun, we have the youthful type, whereas the bearded face of Agamemnon, carrying forward in the ancient Greek culture, relates to maturity, in which a man can only grow a beard from 30 years of age onwards. This lecture introduces the ancient Greek civilization, beginning with the geometric period and then moving into the archaic era. Now, the Greeks are going to bequeath to Western civilization some of our most prized and fundamental beliefs and practices, such as philosophy, mathematics, geometry, and democracy. Now, the Greek world is going to play a role in this development, for they settle in a fairly inhospitable area in the Mediterranean, which then forces them to set up colonies and trade with others, thus developing early on skill sets that would diversify their civilization beyond merely agriculture and cattle raising or animal. Now, the Greek periods, if we are to glance at them here, from the geometric era moving down to the Hellenistic era, are going to shift relatively rapidly from one style to the next as we move through these different historical eras. The reason for this rapid cycling through styles is the Greek belief in the nature of the universe and their belief in the gods merely being immortal humans. Therefore, their ideal will be capturing the perfect individual. As mentioned with the Mycenaean civilization, the Greeks called Greece Hellas. Thus, they are the Hellenes, the Hellenic culture. Now, for the Hellenic culture, the gods that they believe in, they're a polytheistic civilization, but unlike the Near East and in Egypt, the Greek gods are merely immortal humans. They have the same wants and desires, the same foibles and weaknesses that all of us have. They, once again, can make love, they can get injured, they can suffer and feel pain. They are just merely much larger and more perfect than we are. Now, this leads to Protagoras and his axiom for the Greek civilization that man is the measure of all things. And this is very important for understanding the Greeks moving forward. They do not have god kings. There are no pharaohs. There is no representative of the gods on earth. This is a human-centered world, centered in the materialistic aspects of this world. Humans control their own destinies. Now, this is going to come from the Greek creation myth and how we actually got here, according to the ancient Greeks, which is very different than the Egyptians. At the beginning, we find, just like in Sumerian civilization, in Hebrew, in the Christian tradition, and in ancient Egypt, that there is darkness. In this case, Nyx, a big black bird representing darkness, lays an egg. Out of this egg emerges Eros, or the erotic forces of nature that will later become Cupid for the Romans. He makes the two halves of the egg, the earth and the sky, fall in love. That being, the earth will be known as Gaia, who still worship today in many religions, while the sky hovering above is going to be Uranus. Eros makes them fall in love, and they produce the first generation of gods known as Titans. The Titans are going to be giants. They're massive and are an older, cruder generation of gods. The leaders of the Titans are Kronos and Rhea, and as the leader of brother and sister, they are going to mate and give birth to the household names of the Olympians, that being Zeus, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and others. They then come together and overthrow their parents, the Titans, and make way for man. So we know that Zeus has Prometheus create man in the god's image, and then of course give them talents that are associated with the different gods. Being made in the God's image, we find that the universe is also similarly organized. Delineating the space, we have Olympus at the upmost, the topmost area, where the gods are going to live at the top of a mountain, the top of Mount Olympus. That's the vault of the heavens. We live in the central section or flat area of the earth, which is going to have the pillars of heaven off to each side. Thus, mountain ranges are going to demarcate the four corners of the earth. Below us, we have Hades, and finally Tartarus, leading down to chaos, and or where the Christians get the idea of hell. Now, if we look at the land in ancient Greece, we see why they developed technology much more quickly than their neighbors. For they lack decent farmland. There is not a large open series of valleys or plains to plant food to sustain a large population. Therefore, they must import food. But to do that, you need something to trade. So they generally traded for carefully crafted objects or ceramic wares, much like we talked about Crete and so the trade that the Greeks set up extends to the far west of Europe, all the way to the Rock of Gibraltar in Spain. They set up colonies in Sicily and southern Italy we'll look at today, and then also in Asia Minor, or where Turkey. Now, the Greeks give us many important characteristics, ideas, and practices in our civilization. For the city-states are going to emerge in the archaic era known as polis. In them, we find that Corinth rises first, and then Athens in the 6th century BCE. These city-states are ruled democratically by demos and or people. That's what a demos is. It's going to be someone who can vote in the civilization. They can participate in assembly, speak in public, own property, vote, hold office, and go into the army or navy. Only citizens can do these things, and those are going to be property-owning males, so much like America in the early 19th century. Therefore, it is not a perfect system, but a monumental leap forward from the oligarchies and monarchies that have been popular up to this point in history. Think of ancient Egypt, where one man is going to hold power over a vast civilization. The Greeks are going to begin their civilization by adopting motifs and ideas from their neighbors, that being the Egyptians and those in the Near East, leading up to the Akkadians, Persians, and others. So we know that their idea of chimerical priests, of guardian figures, of the poses of their statues, all derive from these earlier civilizations. Where we left off in ancient Greece on the mainland was the Bronze Age and the end of it, where we find the disintegration of social order leads to the Dark Ages around 1000 BCE. Here we have the disappearance of kings, where there is no linear A or B. Everyone is largely illiterate. We find depopulation and poverty occurring. There is no law and order. People are going to live in smaller and smaller communities or tribes until they're going to live basically in shacks or returning to the dwellings in the Neolithic period. It's only around the year 800 BCE that we begin to hear from the Greeks again. They begin trading, creating figures that are going to represent humans in their art, in figurines and painted on ceramics. We are now going to be entering the geometric period of ancient. To illustrate the geometric period, here we have from the Hirschfeld workshop the funerary crater from the Dipylon Cemetery in Athens, from around 750 to 735 BCE. This massive crater, or a bowl designed for mixing punch for parties, you have a funerary scene. Now, during the geometric period, which lasts from 900 to 700 BCE, we have the primary decorative motifs focusing on geometric elements and geometricization. The crater here, used for mixing water and wine to dilute very strong wine for parties, is going to set over a grave. Therefore, it is a grave marker, or functions, as we would understand, of a tombstone or a stele. In this case, the bottom is open, allowing for drainage. So when it rains, it can drain through to the ground. Or, as in some cultures today, we pour ritualistic libations directly through it so the deceased can have it. Now, the meander key pattern at the top of, or the lip of this vase, is going to be very common in the geometric era, where we find this interlocking set of geometric shapes, much like a maze, along the top. And none of the negative space is left. We fill it all in with these geometric shapes. The linear and abstract motifs, which are common in the geometric era, are going to contrast greatly with the organic fluidity from the Minoan civilization. This is going to pick up where we left off on the Greek mainland with Mycenaean art, where we start seeing this reductive geometric approach, such as with the repetitive motifs and angularity are very common, and the same figures shown over and over again foretell this geometric simplicity, the idea of human figures carried out in a linear fashion instead of realistic. Every space in geometric decorated ceramics will be filled. There is no overlapping of the figures to suggest depth. That is rigidly avoided. And anytime there is space in between figures, it is filled in either with these flecks, geometric shapes, or other ornamentation. Now below we have a chariot procession in honor of the deceased, which is going to be common among these civilizations. We also have men who are carrying shields and spears in this procession, and women who pull their hair out, seen here above next to the funeral pyre. So the idea of having figures on a chariot with overlapping horses comes from the Sumerian civilization and is passed on through the ancient Egyptians. Having nude men, right, who are going to be carrying objects is also going to be common from the full frontal pose, or full profile pose, emphasizes these flat patterns. So we find that even though a dead man is lying on a funeral pyre here, and they're laying a funeral shroud over him with this abstract series of checker marks for a blanket, he is seen frontally, as though we are looking at him straight on, instead of in profile. The mourners around the funeral pyre are going to shroud the corpse from view. So just as the ancient Greeks would not show what the afterlife looks like, they're also going to cover up the deceased. They are out of view now. Males and females are distinguished very clearly, for females have breasts and males have penises. Therefore, from the outset of Greek art, they appreciate nudity more so than any other civilization we've looked at. Males and females are shown nude here, leading to just male figures being showed nude here shortly. The only emotional reactions are of the survivors. You'll notice that the dead is not shown in the afterlife. We have no connection to the dead in the Greek civilization, the afterlife being shrouded in mystery and darkness. The underworld is obscured for the Greeks very importantly. We do not have images of Hades or Tartarus. We do not show Hades generally in art, for to speak of death is going to bring it upon you. There are no supernatural beings or reference to the afterlife, and so the style that is adopted is one that celebrates liveliness and records the actions of those left alive here, not celebrating what happens after we die as in the Egyptian civilization. Because the Greeks avoided showing images of the underworld and the afterlife, we focus instead on the deeds of gods, demigods, and heroes, such as this hero and centaur here, possibly a Heracles and Nessus. Now, Heracles is the Greek term for Hercules. These two figures here bound by hand-to-hand struggle, locked in mortal combat. This is an action scene, if we of course read it as such. The centaur is going to be a half-man, half-horse, in this case Nessus, who famously carries off Heracles' bride Deianira when they're crossing a river. We notice, of course, that there is a broken spear tip in his back as though Nessus is wounded. Here is another image illustrating how this famous scene previously was shown, with his hero battling this half-man, half-beast character. Now, the idea of showing the figures fully frontal or fully in profile is in keeping with geometric decoration at this time and era. So on the geometric crater as well, we find that the figures are shown frontally or from the side. Additionally, composite monsters are not new. The Greeks would have discovered these chimerical beasts when they renewed their contact with foreign cultures in the Near East, where we find the Assyrians and their lamassu, different types of sphinxes, and or other guardian figures. However, the centaur is a purely Greek invention. We find that no other culture in history invents the half-man, half-horse hybrid, of course showcasing how important horses were for the Greeks, which they were status symbols owned only by the aristocracy or the elite. Now, what is interesting about this work is, of course, the fact that both of these figures are shown nude, which you would not have seen in the ancient Near East. The natural beauty of the human figure is appreciated by the Greeks and will continue in the male nude in the following centuries. Now, these images are quite small. This is a statuette, and it would have been found in sanctuaries and used much like votive offerings to these gods. Heracles, of course, is going to make his way back up to Mount Olympus with his father Zeus after completing the 12 labors. So he would pray to him, sacrifice to him, as he was a model of suffering on this earth that we can follow, and of course succeed like he did of making it through. Now, just like on the Minoan island of Crete, we have these small statuettes of gods and or these votive offerings that are used to pray to these individual gods. Turning to the next style, we have the Orientalizing phase from 700 to 600 BCE. It's called Orientalizing because Orient means East, and so this is a time in which we have greater trade and access with Near Eastern cultures and in Asia Minor and Egypt. The subjects are also going to be taken from these Near Eastern cultures, such as animals seen in profile or in composite view looking out towards the viewer, painted on examples like this Corinthian Olpe picture. Now, the open composition and large motifs, as we find the further we go into Greek history, the larger these bands become until we'll have only one band eventually decorating these ceramic vessels. On it, we have real or imaginary animals with abstract plant forms or rosettes in the center, and often also decorated with human forms. The rosettes in between the figures in the negative space are stylized flowers, so they are still not yet comfortable with negative space. This black figure technique used to paint the animals that are going to include boars, swans, lions, and bulls are going to show that the figures are going to be black and they're on a pale buff or natural clay background. This will give. The kouros, or kouroi plural, are the first monumental stone statues seen in Greece, and they emerge in the Archaic period around 600 BC. These statues of young, nude males are going to idealize this youthful, athletic figure, symbolizing one's ancestors and thus your fertility. They do not represent individuals and are not individualized. We have a type here of a male figure standing rigidly upright, smiling, with stylized hair and an archaic smile. This archaic smile indicates to the Greeks that the figure is alive, not that the figure is happy, because these are grave markers. So this replaces the geometric crater we looked at earlier as the dominant grave marker in ancient Greece, for this would act as a tombstone being over one. The position of the figure should remind you at this point of Egyptian art because it imports that Egyptian canon, whereby we have a rigidly upright male figure with fists to either side of his thighs, with left foot forward, right foot back. Rigidly upright as well, shoulders level, and once again, his hips and shoulders are parallel to one another. This is, of course, a less lifelike version of what's happening at the same time in Egypt that the Greeks would have access to because they're trading with the Egyptians. It is close-lipped, it is stylized and abstracted. The Greeks at this point still have the remnants of the geometric style and its characteristics in their vocabulary, whereby we have repeated shapes and angles, such as the triangle of the pelvis and the triangle of the rib. This love of patterns is going to carry through and will explain why the Greeks are going to advance in fields of mathematics and geometry. They look for patterns in nature. Again, the figure is male and nude. Thus, we find that these are indistinguishable from gods that are being portrayed at the same time. The only reason we know a figure is a god in the Greek culture is the context in which it is shown and or the object it is holding. So Poseidon would be shown with his trident, or Zeus with his thunderbolt, or Apollo with his bow and moving forward in the archaic era, we have a radical stylistic evolution occurring in a very short time. Here in the next generations, we have the Kroisos, which is of course going to be the name of an individual over the grave that this is found. Here we have a symbolic type, again, not a specific likeness. So we have many of these kouroi that are going to be scattered throughout the Greek world, through all the colonies and the Greek mainland. At the base of this statue, we have the inscription, much like you would find on a stele, marking when someone had died. It reads, "Stay and mourn at the tomb of dead Kroisos, who raging Ares destroyed one day as he fought in the foremost ranks." In it, we have a life-size sculpture that is painted, polychromed, as naturalistic as possible, in encaustic, which, if you remember, is going to be pigment crushed and ground into hot wax. This is the ideal pigment and medium for painting sculptures that would be outside, that would be outdoors, exposed to the elements. So it is amazing that after millennia, the paint remains in different sections. Now, if we compare this kouros to the earlier one, we find that the figure has been fleshed out. We have greater attention paid to the muscular system here, whereby we find the abdominal muscles are detailed and separated from the pectoral muscles, that we find clavicles are detailed and separated from the trapezius. Deltoid, tricep, and bicep are all going to be differentiated. We even have an overemphasis on the fleshiness of the hips here. But we still see, regardless, this move towards a greater interest in anatomical. The archaic smile is still dominant here in kouroi throughout the archaic period, and that's how we know it comes from and derives from this period. We are showing this grave marker over the soldier who died in battle, killed by the god Ares, who will become Mars in the Roman tradition, where we get our word march, for you go to war in March. Turning to representations of women, the Greeks are going to be very hesitant to show them nude in the archaic period onward. In fact, we do not see female nudity in goddesses or upper-class women and subjects until we reach the late classical era. Here we have one of the most common types of a koure, which is a young female, which is also a type, just like the kouros, in which the women will always be clothed, showing little interest in the anatomy underneath. Now the koure is going to differentiate the female figure from the male because she will always be more fleshy and rounded, but still smiling like her male counterpart, that archaic smile identifying her as being produced between 600 and 480 BCE. The peplos core here, named for the peplos garment, which is a four-piece garment that a goddess would wear or a priestess who worships a goddess. This is in fact a votive offering in Athena's sanctuary that we can identify generally only from the object that she would hold in her left hand out towards the viewer. And remember, in these sanctuaries, only priests or acolytes are allowed inside. So we find that the activities in ancient Greco-Roman worship occur outside of the temples in which these are. Just like the male counterpart, the core are also encaustic polychromed or painted with beeswax very brightly, which is jarring for modern sensibilities to think of these white, stark marble or terracotta statues were originally painted very brightly with white skin, red lips, and then the bright dress that we would find as a holdover from the Minoan culture that appreciated this bright, clashing series of colors. Now, as with all core, the female form will always be shown as softer and fleshier, and that it is naturalistic, but certainly not as much interest is paid to the anatomy as the male versions. Now, these types of statues would be seen in a new type of temple invented by the Greeks, for Egyptian monuments are going to be built to glorify godlike rulers, such as the pharaohs. Here we have a massive tomb to the pharaoh. Greek temples, however, are built to worship individual gods who are immortal humans and are decorated with a sculptural ensemble on the exterior. They are understood as giant sculptures we are to walk around. An archaic example of these temples can be found in the Greek colony Paestum here. And here we have, just southeast of Pompeii, a well-preserved series of temples, including the Temple of Hera I. In this temple, named as such because there is another temple to Hera nearby, we have an approximation of what the original structure would have looked like, sans or without the terracotta tiled roof, which has since dissolved, rotted, and faded away. The temple is 170 feet long by 80 feet wide. The interior space would have been taken up with one room or a cella, with a single statue to the goddess Hera on the inside. This is a peripteral temple, as are most Greek temples in the archaic and classical periods. A peripteral temple, by definition, is a triangular structure with freestanding columns on all four sides. On the inside, we have a room which is reserved for the cult statue of the god or goddess it's dedicated to. The further development and refinement of the post and lintel system can be found here, and will remain the ultimate expression of architecture until the Romans invent concrete. The idea of freestanding columns, again, the Greeks are going to adopt from ancient Egypt, who began these investigations into monumental stone edifices with the stepped pyramid at Saqqara, and eventually evolved into circular cylindrical columns that would support a lintel or a horizontal. The Greeks are going to have three orders of architecture that will determine the style, size, design, and orientation of the building it's attached to. These are going to be Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. The Doric order is the least decorative. It has the broadest column and it does not have a decorative capital. It's going to sit directly on a cornice and will often be decorated with triglyphs or metopes. On the upper section we have a pediment, that triangular section that tops the structure. The Doric order is known as the masculine order. It is the most serious and severe order. Thus, it is generally reserved for temples, such as the Temple of Hera I. Developing later from Ionia on the mainland in Turkey today, we have the Ionic order. The Ionic order is going to be more slender, taller, more decorative. It has volutes here, these spirals in the capitals, and is going to have a more decorative cornice, and generally is going to be decorated with a relief frieze. This is the androgynous order, as it's going to be between male and female. It is an effeminate male, if you will. Finally, the Corinthian order is going to be the tallest, the most slender, the most decorative, with abacus scrolls here and then a series of cornices above. It is seen as the feminine order because it is the most elaborately decorative. Now, for temples, obviously the severity and strength necessary to create them are appropriate for the male order, the Doric order. And we notice that the columns are also not going to be completely straight or vertical. They're going to bow outwards in the center. This entasis, as it's known, is a slight curvature that is going to correct the optical distortion that we see with straight lines, so that it is not technically straight, but it will look that way when you're standing in front. Now, in ancient Greek religion, we find that, unlike Christianity or Judaism, we, the congregation or the laity, the common people in a town, do not go inside the temple. Only priests and or their acolytes are allowed inside to talk to the gods. We are on the outside, thus there is a lot of decoration and decorative elements on the exterior of Greek temples, generally showing the gods and or great wars. Now, we are on the exterior, and so we find that the altar is also going to be on the outside, and this is the public sacrifice of generally a bull or a pig. Now, we know the altar is going to be on the east end, thus facing the sun, as are the case for many religions. The Greeks also, with the Romans, Christians, and Egyptians, will be sun worshippers. The temple proper is going to house the cult statue of whatever god or goddess it is dedicated to. One temple for one god. So in this case, we would have seen a cult statue of Hera on the inside. And so we can pray directly to her effigy. Now, the Greek temple design, it is important to note, is mathematically balanced and harmonious, meant to reflect the harmony of the cosmos, and is seen to be mathematically related to the universe, which we can understand again through mathematics. This lecture will continue with the Archaic era in ancient Greece, looking at vase painting and the innovations that the Greeks are going to make there on a two-dimensional surface that eventually make their way to sculpture at the end of the period that we will look at, transitioning to the classical. The Archaic era directly precedes the Classical, and so we find that the necessary evolution to get to these classical philosophers and thinkers that would give us Western civilization are going to find their roots in this era. Now, the Archaic period is often dismissed as merely a necessary evolution to get to the Classical, the shining beacon of Western civilization. However, we know that in the Archaic era, we already have the emergence of many very important ideas and thoughts and practices, including the coining of coinage, and once again Egyptian-inspired temples, Athenian pottery, and philosophy. In this era, we already have Thales, and Anaximander, and Anaximenes, and Zeno, who is famous for Zeno's paradox. These individuals are going to add to our understanding of the Greek cosmos, which is already established in the Archaic era. The Classical era merely builds on it. Now, with Zeno's paradox, we have an excellent example of the type of philosophy that would precede the Classical era, that merely reasons through certain scenarios, and is going to postulate that if given a head start, a tortoise would always outrun the famous Achilles. For, even though Achilles is very fast, the tortoise theoretically would be moving forward, and so therefore there is an infinite number of spaces that Achilles must catch up, and so it would be an infinite paradox. Now, the reason why Greeks developed these paradoxes is going to be because they do not have a religious mandate from the Bible, such as Muslims, Jews, and Christians have with their books, which, of course, lay down the law that God sets forth in examples like the Ten Commandments. Without this, the Greeks had to come up with their own way to understand the universe and the world they live in, how to navigate it, what they should do in it. And so philosophy and ethics were necessary inventions. So in the Greek world, we're now going to be looking at the area where this will be developing around Athens. And archaic vase painting in Athens is going to be the dominant center for pottery in the Greek mainland and in the Aegean. Now, they will adopt Corinthian black figure, first practiced obviously in Corinth, and will use black figure design before switching over to red figure. Here are some examples of the variety of pots and of vases that the Greeks would paint on and illustrate images from their own history, of their great heroes, and of their gods. Now, as time is going to pass in the archaic era, we find that the number of bands will decrease, while the number and the size of figures will also increase, until we have only one band with one narrative frieze and a scene at a time. As an example, we begin with the Francois vase, the potter and painter being Clytius and Ergomatos. We find that in many of these there will be two names associated with these painted vases. One is the potter, the first name, and the second one is the painter, the individual who decorated it. This is an excellent example from the archaic era and a good place to begin our discussion because it is an encyclopedic representation from mythology, specifically episodes from Homer's Iliad, which is going to detail Peleus and his son Achilles, whereas Theseus, the king of Athens, is also referenced, appropriate for a vase in Athenian black figure in this volute crater. Now, this has 6 registers, and you can see that it's called black figure because the figures are painted in black. The registers are going to divide each scene from top to bottom, and we still have decorative elements that are going to carry over in the crater we looked at earlier from the Dipylon Cemetery, where we find that they do have these starburst patterns at the base of the vase, and these floral motifs on the wings of the vase, the handles. But the rest is dedicated solely to action and leaves a bit of negative space so that we can read this action. In the scenes, we find that Athenians play a key role, such as Theseus here battling the centaurs, being invited by the Lapiths to a lush wedding, and then the centaurs become intoxicated and attempt to abduct the maidens and the boys. So remember, in ancient Greece, young boys and pederasty is going to be practiced, just like, of course, they would understand women to be sexual objects. The men protect their maidens and young boys by fighting these half-men, half-horses. To show how feral these beasts have become when they are drunk, they're fighting with rocks and branches, while as the men are going to fight with shields and spears dressed in. We now see the transition to, instead of only showing the figures fully frontal and fully in profile, we have more believable composite views as the centaur is going to be twisting towards us, so we see his torso frontally, but his arms and head are in profile. More believable than the earlier versions. They've also fleshed out the centaur's body and thought out how exactly they would come together. And so the neck of the horse now becomes the abdomen of the man. Now, this large series of bands and registers will decrease until we only have one register, one frieze here that's going to be illustrating monumental figures. In this case, we're still using black figure, and the Amasis painter is going to be illustrating Dionysus with the Maenads. Now, at 13 inches high, this vase is going to be an amphora. and illustrates appropriately a storage jug where we could keep wine. On it we have a painting of the god of wine, Dionysus, who is being presented a dead hare or rabbit by his followers, the worshippers of Dionysus. It is signed right above the rabbit here, Amasis, so we know the painter's name. We do not know the potter's name in this instance. So Maenads are going to be the female worshippers of the god of wine Dionysus, who comes from the east. They present him with an offering, generally of rabbit or deer. Because they will gather in the forests, they will become intoxicated and dance to worship this god. This is an all-female cult of Dionysus. And, importantly, theater is going to be invented to worship him. For we find the place that we look at a theater, the orchestra, is going to be the dancing place, where we're looking towards this in the theatrum. Dionysus is going to hold a canthros, or a wine cup, which you would pour from the storage jug into. And since it's appropriate that we're going to be pouring wine, and he is the god of wine, that he would be holding a vessel for drinking. The increase in bandwidth and the large figures are going to allow more elaborate narratives, and the space in which the figures are going to be located becomes increasingly complex. Now, we keep the decorative patterns at the top and at the bottom of this vessel, and they are not yet entirely comfortable with negative. We find that they favor shapes and patterns over real space at this time in 540 BCE, filling in that negative space behind Dionysus and behind the Maenads with spirals and decorations that flatten out the space. Much like we saw earlier with the elaborately decorative organic motifs on Minoan pottery, especially chimeras ware. The same type of balance can be seen in Euphronios and Euxictios, the painter and potter respectively, for the death of Sarpedon. Here, in a red figure Kylix crater, we have an 18-inch high vessel, which is a punch bowl that would be set out during a symposium, that you would be able to ladle wine. These symposia were Greek gatherings of men, generally of the upper class or aristocratic circles, where they would discuss politics, philosophy, and once again be entertained by hetairae and or very educated prostitutes and or pederastic companions or boys that would fill their cups as a cupbearer. These symposia are going to transform into our modern academic understanding of a symposium, where we gather together and exchange academic information. Here, in this particular decoration, we have Sarpedon, the son of Zeus, who is killed during the Trojan War. We know he is dead because of the death pose he is in, the limp arm falling to the ground, and then the 3 different wounds out of which blood pours. He is killed by the Greek warrior Patroclus in the Trojan War, who is Achilles' best friend, and here he is carried into the Now, Patroclus, Achilles' friend, is going to then in turn be killed by Hector in revenge for killing one of Zeus's children. And of course, in turn then, you find that Achilles fights for the body of Patroclus for funerary rites, and then returns and kills Hector in turn. Thus ends the Iliad with the death of Hector and him being dragged off. Athena, remember, is pro-Greek, and so helps Achilles defeat Hector. And so we have this eye for an eye conflict where one Greek hero dies, then one Trojan hero dies, back and forth. In the painting, we have Hypnos and Thanatos, which are identified by the Greek words coming out of their mouths, as well as Hermes, who is identified by the words spelled out behind his head. He carries the caduceus and has wings on his head and feet, showing us that he is the messenger god, delivering male news for male gods. We find that Iris delivers female messages, we will discuss later on. So these are going to be are going to be creatures that transition us from one plane of existence to the next. And Hermes does this as well, moving us from the land of the living to the land of the dead. Now, the balance here, we should take note of, will become a primary compositional device in the classical era. So it looks like they're moving from left to right, carrying the body of Sarpedon, lifting up his legs and then lifting up his shoulder, while Hermes, his feet are going to be pointing to the right, but he's turned around to the left. And so we find there is a balanced X-shaped composition anchored in the center on the vertical axis with Hermes. The counterbalancing diagonals can be traced from the left leg of Sarpedon up through the wing of one of the Cyclopompoi. Then the fallen left arm of Sarpedon up through the wings of the opposing one. This motion is going to suggest that the figures can move, but are currently balanced perfectly. Now the compositions are very much like the Exekias, Ajax, and Achilles composition. However, the Ajax and Achilles has very little interest in real space, because you'll notice it's pushed up to the surface and written on. We don't move back into the space to understand figures. They are not overlapping one another, for instance. Here, we find that Sarpedon's body twists in space. His leg is sharply foreshortened at an angle to the picture plane, if you note his left leg here. Thus, it's suggesting that we can move back into this space, that he is twisting. He is in front of Hermes, who is behind him, and also that the two Psychopompoi are going to be straddling. This interest in space is going to be carried on in sculpture in a monument that foretells the transition to the classical era on the island. Here at the Aegean, we have the Temple of Aphaia, which is a peripteral, meaning a freestanding series of columns around a central cella. A peripteral temple, a Doric order temple, on a hill overlooking the sea. Now this is common as we turn to look at acropoli throughout the Greek world. They choose, just like the Mesopotamian civilizations before them and the Egyptians, to associate what is high with divinity and the gods. So they will choose the natural projection or hill, the highest point in any area, and build a temple on top of that, so that the surrounding environment can see it, can look up and be reminded that the gods are protecting them. It also affords another aspect of Greek sculpture and architecture, and that is it treats the structure like a sculpture. Here we have 6 columns on the facades and 12 on the sides, giving us a perfect 1:2 ratio for ancient Greek temples. The temple itself is going to be reconstructed here with wood and terracotta tiles at the top on the roof that has since rotted away. In the center, we have the cella, but in order to get to the temple at all, we find, as is true for most acropoli, just like the Acropolis in Athens with the Parthenon, that we're controlling how we see the structure by adding a wall, a short parapet, all the way around the precinct, this religious area. So we find that the temple will then have an altar on the east side of the temple, thus facing the sun. The propylaea, or gatehouse, gives us entrance to this holy area. And then we will always set aside lodgings for priests to always attend to the gods' needs. Now this is the opposite of ancient Egypt, because in Egypt we have long processional approaches. Nearly a mile off we are able to see the temple coming, getting larger and larger. And it is understood as a flat facade, not as a sculptural ensemble, because the Egyptians want to communicate the permanence, the immobility, the eternity that the pharaohs represent in association with the god. The Greeks, on the other hand, their gods are merely immortal humans that don't die, so they do not have the same type of unchanging notion of nature. They believe that it is always changeable. So we have this understanding of their temples as sculptural masses. They are closed and compact and invite you to walk around them and have sculptural decoration around them, not go inside, because only the priests and acolytes go inside of these temples. Now there are 3 main parts to Greek temples: the columns, which is the post and lintel system, the entablature, which can have decoration on it, and the pediment, the triangular section on top, which also can be decorated. On the example that we're looking at here, both of the pediments at Aegian are going to be decorated with the Trojan War and represent the transition from the archaic to the classical. For we begin with the decoration on the side here at 500 BCE with an archaic example. The figures and their placement on the pediment, this triangular arrangement, is going to be dictated by the shape of the space they are. These life-size warriors are going to fall down around the edges as it tapers down to the sides of the entablature. And we find they all center around Athena as a warrior here, as the goddess who's going to be overseeing and protecting the Greeks. Athena is on the Greek side in this instance. Figures fall or crouch on the tapering areas at the edges of the pediment. Here we have an archer, often called Paris, as he is going to crouch, preparing to fire a bow and arrow towards the center of this. Now, he is archaic in the sense that he is fleshed out as far as his anatomy. We do not have a clear focus on the defined musculoskeletal system. And he's also rigidly in profile view. So these figures are either going to be in profile or they're going to be frontal. Very awkwardly positioned in some instances because they are restricted in the archaic era to these positions. Originally, we must remember that these figures would all be polychromed with encaustic and very brightly painted. So here we have, through ultraviolet X-ray fluorescence and microscopy, the coloration that would have been painted on these figures very brightly, with nearly orange-colored hair, bright pink lips, flesh tones for the hands and feet, and then a very bright series of overlaying diamond shapes of green, blue, and orange on his sleeves and in his pants. This is very similar to the decorations we looked at earlier in the archaic example. The figure is often called Paris because it is an arrow that fails Achilles in later tradition. The arrow, supposedly shot by the Trojan prince and brother to Hector, that being Paris, is going to be guided by Apollo in this tradition, who is the patron of Troy, because Zeus forced him to build the walls of Troy. So he is pro-Trojan. So we find that, in tradition, the mother of Achilles, Thetis, dips him in the river Styx, making him invulnerable to attack, except for the area she held, which was the back of his foot. So we have his only weakness being the Achilles. Here we have the dying warrior at the edge of the pediment, on the same side as the archer. And we will note again that the figures are only going to be shown fully frontal or fully in profile. And so the warrior here still has the archaic smile, which is very undecorous and inappropriate for a warrior who has an arrow coming out of his chest that he is pulling out. We originally would have had bronze accessories, and it would have been very brightly painted. The reaction, though, and the pose that he collapses into is not entirely believable or naturalistic. And so the restrictions placed on the positions of figures in the archaic era will give way here on the other side of this temple to a new approach with the same subjects just a decade later. So we can see here, comparing the archer to the dying warrior, that the figures are restricted by this stylistic vocabulary as to how they can move and how they can function and react to certain scenarios. In this case, one is smiling while he lays dying with an arrow in his chest. Just 10 years later, on the other side of the temple, on this next east pediment that is decorated, we have a very interesting evolution that happens very rapidly. With the same types of figures, we still have archers, we still have dying warriors, and we still have Athena overseeing these Greek warriors. We now have a new approach. For just a decade later, we have a greater interest both in anatomy, spatial construction, and here we find that the warrior who is felled, about to die, has fallen to the ground and precariously balances himself on his shield, trying to pull himself up off of. If we compare the expression of this warrior to the archaic example, we note that he no longer smiles. The archaic smile is noticeably absent. Instead, it is replaced by genuine suffering and pathos. We find that he cringes. He is trying to control his suffering, yet at the same time, we see the pain in his eyes and his expression. We now note he also has a beard, showing he is a mature warrior. This transitions into the ideal we will talk about in the classical. Turning to the position of these figures, we can see that the awkward frontal and profile position that the original archaic dying warrior is in gives way to a more natural, foreshortened position of the leg of this warrior, and as he twists around to try to push himself up with his right arm as he balances his shield with his left arm. Thus he activates different planes, contorting his body in space, thus showing us that he's activating different planes in space. So capable of turning now, we have this softness of flesh balanced by a sophistication of anatomy, a sophisticated understanding of the different muscular groups and what they do as they move in space. Now, the emotional involvement of the spectator here empathizes with this fallen warrior who is in agony. He is vulnerable at this point. He is at the end of his life. Therefore, we appreciate the suffering of the figure. The transition to the early classical period that we see here is going to take its cues from the characteristics that are discovered in innovations in vase painting we just looked at, such as in the death of Sarpedon, where we start to consider that there is space behind the surface and we can actually move figures to occupy that space more realistically.